Now, the Three Martini Lunch with Greg Corombos and Jim Geraghty.
And welcome, everyone, to the Monday edition of the Three Martini Lunch, along with Jim Geraghty of National Review, also the author of Between Two Scorpions. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. We have good, bad, and crazy martinis for conservatives today. And if you thought it was going to be a slow Monday, well, we got news for you. It's not. Let's start with the good martini. And, of course, one of the many headlines, Jim, that came out of last Thursday's marathon Democratic debate in Houston was Beto O'Rourke saying, yes, absolutely, we're coming after your AR-15s, we're coming after your AK-47s. These weapons of war cannot be used against our children. And that made a lot of people happy in the hall, maybe in the Democratic liberal Twitter sphere, but it's making some actual Democrats who are in office a little bit nervous here, one of whom is Chris Coons, the Democratic senator from Delaware, who you might remember from the Kavanaugh process, foreshadowing, when he and Jeff Flake teamed up to create an extra week of drama last year. Here's what he had to say on CNN following Beto O'Rourke's comments.
Are you supportive of a mandatory buyback program for all of those weapons, all of those assault rifles on America's streets right now?
I am not. And I frankly think that that clip will be played for years at Second Amendment rallies with organizations that try to scare people by saying Democrats are coming for your guns.
He says it's too soon to know if it'll damage the party, and he says he knows where Beto's coming from. It's very emotional since his community of El Paso was hit recently with a mass shooting. But, Jim, to what extent do you think he's right? To what extent do you think that Beto pretty much imploded the Democratic narrative built up over the past generation or more that the party's not out to get your guns?
Yeah, I mean, the one quibble I would have with Coons is if you've said that's what you want to do, well, then it's certainly nothing dishonest about it. You're not misleading people about it. There have always been Democrats who have effectively, you put a drink or two in them and they say, we should go around and take out all the guns. But what really matters isn't just that Beto said it. It was the reaction both from that crowd. Like there was no boos. If there had been an awkward silence or only a smattering of applause, well, then maybe that would be, okay, Democrats aren't. Look, there was roaring applause, and almost instantaneously, the Beto O'Rourke campaign had a T-shirt made up of it, and they're marketing all that kind of stuff. There are a whole bunch of Democrats who absolutely, totally believe in trying to confiscate weapons that have been legally sold, legally purchased, and that have not been used in any crimes. And, that's going to not sit well with a whole bunch of people for a really good reason. No one's trying to take your guns, you paranoid loons. It doesn't fly anymore. We know this is what a whole bunch of Democrats would like to do. We know this is certainly what the most vocal, active, progressive base of the party wants. Are there some Democrats who aren't so comfortable with this? Sure, Coons would appear to be one of them. But he is a party that is at the very least comfortable with that. No, by the way, there's recent polling numbers that said a significant number of Democrats agree with the San Francisco City Council declaring the NRA a domestic terrorist organization. So, heck yeah, this is going to be played at the next NRA convention. Heck yeah, this is going to be, Republicans are going to seize on this. They ought to, because it's true. And, oh, by the way, this means that for the past, minimum 15 years, probably 20 to 30 years, there's been this argument where Republicans or people who support the Second Amendment would say, you want a database of who owns what gun? No, I don't trust you with that. You're going to, I think someday the government could try to use that to try to collect everybody's guns. You want to keep permanent records of all kinds of No, I'm not going to do any of that kind of stuff. Now you know why. And the whole argument, there were two sides. The Democrats said, no one wants to confiscate your guns. And Republicans said, yes, there is. Well, Beto O'Rourke and the reaction of that crowd in that hall proved it. There's a certain school of thought that would say the Democrats might as well just go ahead and embrace gun confiscation. And they'll lose a lot, but they may actually move the ball a little bit further in their direction by being honest about it, instead of this really implausible two-step that they've been trying to do for, 15, 20 years.
Jim, let's move on to our bad martini now. And this definitely qualifies as bad, since we could be potentially closer to the brink of significant war in the Middle East. That's because drones attacked major Saudi oil facilities, and according to most reports, halving their production, cutting it in half. And so the Houthi rebels are taking responsibility for this. Here's Elaine Quijano of CBS News with the summary here. Elaine Quijano, you might remember, she was the moderator for the vice presidential debate. You might forget because Tim Kaine kept interrupting everyone. I like to think of her as the counterbalance to Wolf Blitzer because he gets excited about everything, and Elaine Quijano is just very calm about everything. Here's her summary of what happened.
Iran is denying involvement in attacks on Saudi oil plants hours after the U.S. placed the blame on Tehran. Drone strikes hit two major oil facilities in Saudi Arabia Saturday. The attacks could have an impact on energy prices as the plants are some of the world's largest producers of crude oil. Houthi rebels in Yemen claimed responsibility for the strikes. But Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says Iran was behind them. A commander from the Iranian Revolutionary Guard responded to the accusation Sunday. He said U.S. bases and aircraft carriers in the region are within striking distance of Iranian missiles.
Well, the Houthi rebels are sponsored by Iran. They're the Iran proxy in Yemen. So there's Iranian fingerprints here, regardless of how you want to define it, Jim. So where do we stand after all this?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I just put up a corner post on this with some useful links. When they say, like, the Iranians back the Houthi rebels, occasionally, they're just proxies or something. Look, Iran has sent them pretty much every weapon they could possibly launch. Rockets, landmines, anti-aircraft weapons, you name it, the Iranian arsenal, they've sent it along to the Houthis. Also training to these guys how to use all these weapons. Intelligence about where their targets are and stuff like that. So it's really hard to say where the Houthis stop and where the Iranians begin. If you see anybody floating it wasn't the Iranians, it was the Houthis. It's a little bit like the Russian-backed, totally not the Russian army militia that was in eastern Ukraine that shot down the Malaysian airliner. At some point, like when you're starting to do everything to train and to organize a fighting group and they do something terrible, you can't just say, look, it's those guys. I barely know those guys, as the excuse anymore. This is bad. We've kind of had this attitude of, since Trump's been president, we really haven't had any serious foreign policy crisis. I mean, there's Hong Kong, there's Venezuela, there's, Eastern Ukraine. Stuff has happened. We really haven't had the, oh, my God, turn on CNN, something's blowing up. Wait for Wolf Blitzer to tell us to stand by. The Situation Room reporting on what's going on in the Situation Room type foreign policy crisis. We might be getting there. This is, yellow alert, as they would say on the Starship Enterprise. This is deeply concerning because, one, oil prices are going to go up high. We're not as dependent on, in fact, we're really not dependent on Saudi Arabian oil anymore, but the rest of the world sort of is. And, when global demand or global supply gets disrupted, demand stays the same, prices go up. Eventually, it's going to start affecting U.S. consumers. I'm glad Trump decided to open up the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. This seems like exactly the sort of situation that we have it for. By the way, for everybody who thinks I don't want to say nice things about Trump, hey, good job, Mr. President. Now, on this, as I lay out in a corner post today, we got 4 options, and all of them are bad or at minimum risky, maybe a 5th one. First option is do nothing and hope that the problem goes away. It's probably not going to happen. Option 2 is pay the Danegeld. The French want to give the Iranians a $15 billion loan. Maybe if we sign on to that, we can bribe them into better behavior, Greg. Now, the problem is, if that doesn't work, you've just given somebody who hates you an extra $15 billion to use to hurt you. Option 3 is trust the Saudis to respond to this. And there are some very bright foreign policy experts who say, look, you know what? This is Saudi Arabia's fight. We've sold them every weapon they could ever possibly want. Let them go for it. It's their fight. Go for it, guys. I don't know about you, Greg. These are the guys who keep blowing up school buses in Yemen and prisons and, water desalinization plants and all kinds of. They've got a really lousy record of hitting civilians when they're aiming for military guys. I could very easily see the Saudi counterstrike against this, escalating things. Option 4 is the U.S. Pentagon, that we decide to handle the response, that we start to do something. And we could hit, oil rigs off the shore of Iran. We could hit the Iranian Navy. Apparently, according to Eli Lake, we know where there are a whole bunch of Iranian assets outside of the Iranian territory. That would seem to be the one that would be our best way of controlling a proportional response. Of course, if you do that, there's always a chance that Iran strikes, Iran reacts like this is a declaration of war and starts trying to strike Americans directly back there. And then the 5th one, maybe the best option, but it all kind of depends on circumstances, is we all remember when Trump tweeted out that, hey, remember this thing that blew up in Iran, that launch site? We had nothing to do with it. We have no idea how it happened. By the way, here's our high-resolution satellite photo that's classified that I probably shouldn't share. That would be most convenient, but it always depends on what can you do, what kind of covert assets do you have in the region, what kind of intelligence, all that kind of stuff. So I mean, again, my sense is when Iran does something this big, you've got to respond in some way. You kind of wonder if the decision to call off the counterstrike on Iran a couple months ago, this is the consequence of that Iran isn't really afraid of us anymore. Maybe things will calm down a bit, Greg, but look, it's Iran. Things are never going to calm down for that long.
All right, let's move on to our crazy martini now, Jim. And it is September, which is now better known as Brett Kavanaugh Defamation Month for the second consecutive year.
Anniversary.
Happy anniversary.
Hey, happy Bash Kavanaugh Day.
Yeah, so over the weekend, we've got the New York Times publishing a story related to a book that two of its reporters are doing, basically following up on the whole Kavanaugh saga from a year ago. And this got a lot of attention. So if you have little ears in the car or with you, hit pause, please. We also uncovered a previously unreported story about Mr. Kavanaugh in his freshman year that echoes Ms. Ramirez's allegation. That goes back to Deborah Ramirez. She was the second accuser that the New York Times wouldn't even touch that story. Ronan Farrow and his colleague eventually had to publish that because she didn't actually remember it, and then she thinks it might have been Kavanaugh, and so there was a lot of questions related to that. So anyway, this story allegedly echoes Ms. Ramirez's allegation. A classmate, Max Steyer, saw Mr. Kavanaugh with his pants down at a different drunken dorm party where friends pushed Mr. Kavanaugh's male anatomy into the hand of a female student. And so that, of course, got a lot of people very interested in what the political and legal ramifications of this are. Without waiting for any context or further details, you had 4 different Democratic presidential candidates insisting that Kavanaugh resign or be impeached, including Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren, Beto O'Rourke, of course, and Julian Castro. But there's a little bit more to the story, in addition to the fact that Mr. Steyer wouldn't actually go on the record with the New York Times or the book, so people who are actually getting the story secondhand at best were the source for this. Meanwhile, this got added later as an editor's note. An earlier version of this article, which was adapted from a forthcoming book, did not include one element of the book's account regarding an assertion by a Yale classmate that friends of Brett Kavanaugh pushed his anatomy into the hand of a female student at a drunken dorm party. The book reports that the female student declined to be interviewed, and friends say she does not recall the incident. That information has been added to the article. Jim, what do you make of the New York Times and their ethics here?
Not much, Greg. Not much. First of all, again, I'm curious. I really do want to learn if there's been a change in what students in journalism are taught. Because if I came to an editor with this at any point earlier in my career, they would not run it. They would say, look, you don't have a story here. You have somebody saying through the telephone game that they heard from somebody who heard from somebody. If the original witness has told others she does not recall it happening, then you don't have a story, right? You need to have that firsthand witness there. So the other thing which is noting is this is not in a news article by the New York Times. Should have been a glaring red flag number 1. This allegation was not in the headline, glaring red flag number 2. This is part of a book excerpt. Well, this is a kind of neither fish nor fowl sort of situation for a newspaper when one of their correspondents has been writing a book on the side. They have information in the book. They put it out there. They're running an excerpt. Keith Urban, who's a really good book agent, was saying today, look, it's always tough to take a long book and take, maybe 2% of it and turn it into an excerpt and give people an accurate sense of what's in the book. Having said that, it's really hard to say, oh, by the way, to leave out, oh, by the way, later in the chapter, it turns out she declined to be interviewed and friends say she doesn't recall the incident. That's got to be in there. That's got to be right up there. And again, if people will say, there's Ron Fournier, who's otherwise a nice guy, but who keeps saying, oh, look, the media makes mistakes, but the important thing is they admit it and they learn from it and they move on. No, they don't. They may admit it when somebody like Molly Hemingway calls them out and says, hey, I got a copy of your book. I've read ahead. Spoiler alert, she doesn't remember it. This stuff kind of matters. The attitude of, Greg, I was racking my brain today, and I was debated tweeting this out. I don't know. Can you remember any case in which the media ran with a false accusation against a lefty and shoddy journalism, didn't check with the sources, really destroyed somebody's reputation? It was somebody on the left, and then they came back and said, oops, never mind.
Hard to think. I don't know anybody on the left that did the Menendez story. That's the only one on the left that even comes close to coming to mind. But I don't think the left
even then it was a hung jury. That's why there was no evidence. Clearly, prosecutors thought there was enough there to go to, a grand jury was convinced that there was enough to go. I mean, I suppose some folks might say Franken, but it's not like any of his accusers retracted it. The defense, particularly from the Jane Myers of the world, is like, who hasn't cupped a butt every now and then while posing for a picture? He's clumsy. He just accidentally gropes women. And I just don't think that. But, by the way, sorry, listeners, if you had your kids in the car. Kids, don't do that stuff. It's deeply frustrating. You have this feeling that the New York Times would never do this. It's been really wild to watch this bonfire of journalistic reputations since the Kavanaugh thing started. And there's just so much intensity. The only other thing I would note here is if you're wondering, why there's this. I mean, some people say, first of all, this is not actually about Kavanaugh. This is about the inevitable departure of Ruth Bader Ginsburg from the court and/or this plane of existence, and the fight to replace her, and the idea of trying to delegitimize the right of center majority on the court for years to come. That's probably a factor. That's probably something that's lurking in the background of somebody's mind. So let's also note, again, this is at Yale, right? This is in Georgetown Prep, right? These are elite institutions, people who are, born at the top, stayed near the top, accomplished, bright kids, went on to, do great things in life. And let's face it, probably left of center in most cases. Obviously, Kavanaugh demonstrates there were some conservatives in institutions like that. But by and large, if you're Brett Kavanaugh's age and you went to Georgetown Prep and you went to Yale at that time period, you probably were, you're probably left of center. And it probably irks you that one of your classmates is now on the Supreme Court. It probably irked not just for his, resentment of his professional accomplishments and all that, but out of all the people you knew, that guy ends up on the Supreme Court. So there was this anecdote that stuck with me. It was a guy who wrote a book about the 9/11 hijackers. He wrote in a column in 2006, all the people he'd spoken to who were absolutely convinced they had run across the hijacker Muhammad Atta sometime in the months or years before the hijackings. And, the 9/11 Commission had tried to review all this stuff, to work through the timeline, figure out from things like ATM receipts and security footage and passport information and car rental stuff, trying to piece about where they could be certain that Muhammad Atta was and was not. And the end result was that there were dozens of people who were totally convinced that they had interacted with Muhammad Atta, including, according to this guy, 2 women who were convinced they'd married him, even though it was pretty obvious it was impossible, that he could not have been when and where they described it. And he's talking about how the mind works. And he says that some people, one, obviously they saw the passport photo, they see the face, and your mind kind of puts the face onto this memory of this, 30-something Arab guy you encountered with years ago who acted kind of weird or something like that. And your mind actually edits your memories to what you want to believe. We've all talked about motivated reasoning. This is sort of motivated remembering. And my suspicion is that, at Yale and at Georgetown Prep, they're probably, look, first of all, Kavanaugh's been straightforward about this. Sure, he was a drinker, and sure, he was a party guy, and he liked beer and all that kind of stuff. Now, did he do the horrible things he's accused of? No, but, the chances are, if there was a raging kegger, you might have seen old Brett Kavanaugh there. There probably were some guys in those circles who might have been jerks. There might have been some other people who may have done some of these things that Kavanaugh is being accused of. If you hate Brett Kavanaugh and you remember some jerk from Yale, at some point your mind is going to try to connect those two and say, hey, that jerk who I vaguely remember from 30, 40 years ago, that was Brett Kavanaugh. And that happens to the very best of people can end up having, they edit their own memories this way. This is one of the reasons cops get very nervous about eyewitness testimony, particularly the more time that goes by. Anyway, that's where we are with this. I think it's very depressing. I think it's going to, blow up in their faces. Because there were a whole bunch of people who were not big Trump fans who ended up being, going to the mattresses during the Kavanaugh fight last year. If now of course now half the Democratic field has called for impeaching Kavanaugh. Hey, you know what? You want to make the 2020 election a referendum on impeaching Kavanaugh? Go right ahead. I'm sure the Trump campaign would love to have that every day of the week and twice on Sundays. I would say twice on Sundays, but we vote on Tuesdays, so maybe they prefer that twice on Tuesdays.
So, Jim, we got a problem here, but of course it's the Republicans' fault. E.J. Dionne, liberal columnist over at the Washington Post, quoting Brett Kavanaugh, says the Supreme Court must never, never be viewed as a partisan institution, unquote. But Dionne says that's exactly what it is, thanks to a GOP determined to control it by any means available. It's why questions about Kavanaugh and the court haunt us. Jim, that is some amazing revisionism there, and it just makes me wonder that if the Democrats are already setting the stage for if they do actually win in 2020, trying to delegitimize a Supreme Court that might stand in the way of what a Democratic administration might want to do.
Oh, I think it's extremely likely. Look, E.J. Dionne does make a really good point, though, Greg, in that, Democrats are just so nice. They never make negative attacks. They never get personal. There's no one in the media who's willing to amplify their arguments and messages. Nobody's ever really willing to criticize. Just look at how the coverage of Brett Kavanaugh and how kind everybody was to him throughout the entire process. We lose because we're so nice. You know who believes that, Greg? Losers. That's right? It is the most self-flattering explanation you could ever possibly come up with. We're just so virtuous. We're just so good that if we just got as nasty as the other side, and complete obliviousness to the nastiness of, I think is pervasive on both sides of politics. So, yeah, it's a happy fairy tale that liberals tell themselves so they can go to sleep at night.
I think Kavanaugh just needs to make September Beach Month instead of Beach Week, but new term starts in a couple weeks. Jim, see you tomorrow.
Oye, oy vey.
See you tomorrow. Happy Monday.
See you tomorrow, Greg.
Jim Geraghty of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks for being with us today. And be sure to tune in again on Tuesday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.